Good evening, Year 11. This is your night before news for your English Literature Paper 2 exam that you will sit tomorrow. For your reference and as a reminder, the exam will be 2 hours and 15 minutes long and will contain 3 sections. Section A will be on an Inspector Calls, Section B will be on Power and Conflict Poetry, and Section C will be Unseen Poetry. So starting with section A, which is an Inspector Calls, you will get 2 questions and you will have a choice of 1 question out of the 2 that you would like to answer. You could be asked to comment on a character or a theme, or it might be a question that combines the 2. Characters could include people like Gerald, Eva, the Burlings and the Inspector. Themes could include things such as social class, responsibility, guilt, age and gender. It's really important that you pick the question that you think you can answer the best. You don't have to write about both, but what makes this particular part of the exam difficult is you'll not get an extract, so remembering quotations is going to be really important. So let's start by looking at an example. So how does Priestley present the inequality that exists amongst the social classes? I want you to just spend a moment thinking about the focus of the question. So as you probably worked out, the key focus of the question is the inequality between the social classes. I would probably devote around 5 minutes of your time to just mind mapping some key ideas that you might write about in your response. And then think about, before you start writing, how you might turn those ideas into chronological order. So to give you some examples, you could have talked about how Priestley exposes a commonplace exploitation and immoral behaviour of the upper middle classes. You could then go on to write about how Priestley highlights how the exploitative behaviour of the rich led to the suffering of the working classes, and how Priestley advocates for a society that is classless and therefore equal. As a reminder, this should be something that's quite familiar to you by now. We've spent quite a lot of time in lesson thinking about how we can structure our responses so that it's quite cohesive and quite linked. Ultimately, what you want to try and do is formulate a few ideas which become your thesis or your introduction. You then need to think about proving those thesis ideas in chronological order across the course of the play. Each idea needs to then link back really closely to the overall thesis that you laid out at the beginning of your response. So going back to the 3 ideas we just talked about, Priestley exposes the commonplace exploitation and immoral behaviour of the upper middle classes. Priestley highlights how the exploitative behaviour of the rich led to the suffering of the working classes, and Priestley advocates for a society that's classless and therefore equal. I want you to now just spend a little bit of time, maybe pause this and think about some ideas, some quotations, some moments that you could write about that would help prove this point. Okay, so here's some examples that you could use. Obviously, they're not the only examples, but there's some examples that you could use to prove the points. So in terms of the first point, Priestley exposes a commonplace exploitation and immoral behaviour of the upper classes. Possible evidence that you could use is Mr. Burling saying, "It is my duty to keep labour costs down," and how he is exploitative towards his workers. You could also explore Eric's exploitative behaviour when he tries to justify his assault of Eva, when he says, "I was in that state where a chap easily turns nasty." Moving on to section 2, you could highlight how the exploitative behaviour of the rich led to the suffering of the working classes. Possible evidence that you could use is from the inspector's final speech, where he says there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, highlighting the idea that Eva Smith has gone and Eva Smith has died, but there are actually still millions of people suffering, men and women, and that the suffering is widespread. Finally, Priestley advocates for a society that's classless and therefore equal. Again, we could pick something from the inspector's final speech. We're all members of one body. We're responsible for each other. So this key quotation that reminds the audience of the need for this collective responsibility. So to recap, in terms of your essay structure, make sure you start with a clear thesis that outlines your key ideas about the theme or the character in the question. Think about around 3 moments in the play that help support your thesis ideas. Organise and write about these moments in chronological order. Now on to section B, which is your power and conflict poetry. So a few reminders about what this might look like. You're only going to get one question, so there's going to be no choice. You're expected to compare two poems. The question will name one poem, and you have to write about this poem. The named poem helpfully will be printed on the exam paper. You will then need to select a poem with linked ideas to compare to the named poem. You must know some quotations from this poem from memory, and you'll have about 45 minutes to answer this question. So to give you an example, compare how poets present power in Storm on the Island and one other poem. So you'll get your question, and as you can see on this slide, you'll get a copy of the poem itself. So in terms of how you might approach the question, maybe start with mind mapping some key ideas in response to the question based on the poem that you have in front of you. So identify which poem you're being asked to write about, identify the theme that you're being asked to explore about in your response, so obviously in this case power. Start thinking about which poems you can pick to compare with Storm on the Island, and maybe then thinking about ideas that link the two poems you could compare. You then want to think about quotations you could accept from Storm on the Island that you could use to support these ideas, and try and recall some quotations from your comparison poem also. So as an example, one poem that compares quite nicely with Storm on the Island is Extract from the Prelude. And I might then formulate a couple of ideas that I could explore. So in terms of power, both explore the power of nature. Both poems explore the powerlessness of man against nature. Once you have your ideas, it's then about finding evidence that you could use to support those ideas. So I just want you to spend a moment, maybe pause this right now and look at the poem Storm on the Island and the poem Prelude and think about some evidence that you could use to support those ideas. Once you have your ideas and you have your evidence, you're then ready to start writing. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what the actual structure of the response might look like. So you'll start by outlining the comparative ideas that you'll explore in your response as maybe a short sort of introduction. You'll then go on to the main body paragraphs. So for example, you'd start with in both, and you'd insert the named poem and the comparison poem. The writer explores the idea that power is, and you would outline the first comparative idea. And then you would move on to going to your first poem. So for example, in Storm on the Island, the poet explores the idea, you'll insert your idea, and then through, insert your evidence, and then make sure that when you're looking at the evidence, you identify any methods, and you make sure that you include a detailed analysis, so picking out as many words or phrases as you can to make sure that what you're writing is developed. It's really important that ideas are really closely linked to the intentions of the writer and the original idea that you set out at the beginning of the paragraph. You then need to make a link, so this is similar to, this is different to, however, and you repeat the same process again for your second poem. So what's the idea, what evidence you could use, what methods is being used in that evidence, and how you might analyse it, linking it closely to the intentions of the writer. You want to aim to do at least two detailed comparisons between the two poems. If you have time to do more, do, but it's about the quality of what you write rather than trying to do multiple different comparisons. So finally, section C is the unseen poetry and unseen poetry comparison. This is often a section that isn't done quite so well because people have probably spent far too much time on section A and B, but just as a reminder, this question between the two questions within it is worth as many marks as the first two sections. So it's important that you attempt both questions and you write in as much detail as you possibly can. The section contains two questions. So question 1, where you have to write a response to an unseen poem, and then question 2, where you compare the poem from question 1 with an unseen poem in question 2. Question 1 is worth 24 marks. You should leave yourself at least 35 minutes on this one, and you need to write a focused personal response that includes evidence from the poem and analysis of the writer's methods in that quotation. Please make sure that you attempt question 2, because even though it's only worth 8 marks, we must attempt every question because we can't afford to lose 8 marks. You should spend 10 minutes on this, and you must compare the methods that the writer uses to communicate their ideas. This just gives you some examples. You will have seen other examples in lessons, but here you have section A. In a daughter leaving a home, how does the poet present the speaker's feelings about her daughter? So you'd have an attempt at that question first, which is your 24 marker, and then you'd go on to the 8 marker. In both Poem from My Sister and To a Daughter Leaving Home, the speakers describe feelings about watching someone they love grow up. What are the similarities and or differences between the way the poets present those feelings? So you would focus very much on maybe one quotation from each and the methods that the writers use to convey those feelings. When first writing about the poem, it's really important that you read it through a few times to just make sure that you're 100% sure of what the poem's about. We've taught you in lesson the process: title, first line, last line, turning point, and then making sure that we're reading through the whole poem. This just kind of gives you a way of kind of decoding meaning and working out what the poem is about. Once you think you have a clear sense of what the poem is about, it's useful to maybe list 2 to 3 ideas you can explore which relate to the focus of the question. So in this case, the speaker's feelings about their daughter, and being prepared before you start writing with some quotations you might use to support the ideas. You would then go on to your second poem. So your second poem and your second question. You will have some ideas already that you've put in your 24 marker that you could use in this, but it's about then thinking about how those feelings are communicated in your second poem. So start thinking about how exactly does the poem link to the question focus? So in this case, it's like what the speaker's feelings about their sister growing up. Pick out one relevant quotation. You don't need more than that, but it's important that you're mentioning methods and thinking about whether the feelings and methods used are similar or different. All that's left to say is a massive good luck, Year 11. You are really well prepared. You have essay plan booklets that you can look at and review tonight. All of these are on Arbor if you can't locate your booklet. It's really, really important that you get ready. Confidence is key. Good luck.